Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have my friend Rupali here today. She runs a Montessori school, and I think we met, I don't know how many years ago, when I was teaching my niece Montessori using, in my apartment. So it's going to be amazing, and she's going to be talking about Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan in a very interesting way. So take it away, Rupali.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And give me just a second here. So I met Shrikant, I will say about 23 years ago. And when we met, it was in a playground, and he asked me, when I told him I was an architect, he asked me about Louis Sullivan. And I was very surprised that, somebody knew Louis Sullivan, because he's not one of the famous architects for, just a common man. Usually in the field of architecture, engineering, you know about Louis Sullivan. But most people know Frank Lloyd Wright, and not Louis Sullivan as much. So I thought Shrikant was an architect, and he said he wasn't an architect. So then we were talking about education. My son was very young, and his niece was about 3 years old. And he mentioned Montessori. And I thought, okay, I know that word because I went to a Montessori school when I was in preschool. And I thought, it's very interesting that Shrikant knows about Montessori. So I thought maybe he had gone to a Montessori school. And we began to talk, and he told me that Maria Montessori was an Italian doctor, and we were at a public library together, and we found her Montessori handbook. And I was so surprised because I always thought she was Indian. In India, Montessori method was so prevalent in the 70s and 80s, right from the 1920s. There was an Indian poet, Rabindranath Tagore, and he started the Tagore Montessori schools in the 1920s. And then Maria Montessori spent a lot of time in India. She was there for 7 years, and she did a lot of work in Kodaikanal in India. So I thought that Montessori was an Indian word because my mom would always say, you're going to Montessori. Where, if anybody asked my mom, which school does your child go to, she would just say Montessori. And so it took me a long time to realize that Montessori was not an Indian word. It was actually an Italian word and an Italian lady. So when Shrikant was teaching his niece Montessori in his apartment, we began to collaborate, and we began to do work with both the children at our homes. And we found that the children were just absorbing everything. And by the time his niece was 3.5, she was reading and putting words together. My son, who was almost a year and a half, he would just follow her and was just picking up things by listening and emulating Shrikant's niece. So, not only did I have my experiences to remember, but I also had I could witness my son and Shrikant's niece making progress. So that's how I got into the Montessori method as an educator. I started working with my son at home, and then took my training and became a Montessori educator. So what I want to do, Shrikant, Sherry, Joya, Maritza, Rob, and I were part of a conversation about Kindergarten Chats, a book by Louis Sullivan. And while we were reading that book, I learned about Louis Sullivan's ideas on education, and they are so in line with Maria Montessori's. So I asked Shrikant if I could do a syntopical presentation on Louis Sullivan and Maria Montessori's ideas. And the more I read, the more I thought it was a very large scope. So for today's presentation, I'm just going to refer to these two books, Kindergarten Chats by Louis Sullivan and The Formation of Man by Maria Montessori. So here on the right is an illustration of a Montessori student. She drew this illustration at school when she was in elementary school, and the work is called metal inset work. So you have metal insets, and you trace the metal insets, you discover different shapes, and then you color. And what you can see here is a child paying a lot of attention to detail. Now, this child is Anne Frank. So this is Anne Frank's metal inset work that she did in her classroom. Students before Anne Frank and after Anne Frank, they still continue to do this work in their classrooms. But you can see the attention to detail. You can see how beautiful the work is. This child must have taken a while to draw all these patterns, and to get to this point, she must have started with just a simple circle and then made multiple iterations to come to this point. So the idea is that in a Montessori classroom, you have the time to do those multiple iterations and come up with something really profound that you don't get when you're rushed from one class to another class. So that's a big difference in Montessori. So who is Maria Montessori? In her education philosophy, in the pedagogy that Maria Montessori lays out, she asks the question, who am I? And she says the child is on his own discovery of who the child is, who am I? And she says that the goal of education is for the child to discover who the child is and how do they fit in society. So who was Maria Montessori? So she was born in Italy. She was a physician. She loved math and science when she was in school. She came from a very loving family, and her mother encouraged her a lot. Her father didn't quite support her choice of education of becoming a doctor because it was against the regular cultural norms. But she did become the first female physician in Italy. She studied at the University of Rome. And then after graduating from the medical school, she started working in the psychiatric clinic at the university. And she was just aghast by the conditions of these children because they were really left with no materials, nothing to stimulate them. And what she did was she did experiments with them with just bread or small materials that she would take into their environment. And she found that even children who were mentally disabled were able to respond and think when they were in an environment that stimulated their brain. So she then took a course in education and came across the works of various previous educators. She also looked at Aristotle's work, and then she started doing her own experiments and developed a pedagogy now that we call Montessori method. And Louis Sullivan, so he is known as the father of modern skyscrapers. And he also asks the question multiple times, who am I? What is my worth, right? And one of the things he talks about is that for a building must be solid, useful, and beautiful. And as an architect, it's not just you're going to create a building, you're actually creating a fabric for society. So one of his main ideas was that you have stone and wood and materials around you. Those materials are not going to do anything until the human element makes an entrance. And that, he says, is architecture. It's the human effect on the materials. The other part of Louis Sullivan, he was born in Boston, and he spent a lot of time in his childhood in nature, looking at nature, studying nature. He was a thinker, and he deeply believed in the idea of America, the idea of an individual, the idea of democracy. He believed that individual actions and values shape the society that we live in. He also believed that, the education system that existed back then, which hasn't changed much even now, does not support the natural instincts, the natural characteristics of man, and he defined those man's powers. So in that way, Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan are similar in their thinking about man. I want to read a passage from Louis Sullivan's book about, he talks about who am I? Give me just a second over here. He says that a man should man do less in satisfying utilitarian needs? It's the function of the poet in whatever walk of life to regard these things, to make them his own, to express them in his work, whatever those works, whatever his special activities may be. Thus, do we enlarge our working conception of nature and utility of the poet. On the other hand, you cannot express whatever your walk in life unless you have a system of expression. And you cannot have a system of expression unless you have a prior system of cognate thinking and feeling. You cannot have a system of thinking and feeling unless you've had a basic system of living. So he's talking about what humans have to do to get to the point that the work that the humans do are a reflection of who they are, whether you're a poet or a writer or a thinker, an architect. The work reflects the man in their actions. So if Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan were to meet each other, I think they would say, I have a proposition. And Maria Montessori would say, follow the child. And Louis Sullivan would say, form follows function. So it's very interesting how the two of them came to these conclusions about follow the child and form follows function. When I was a new teacher, I always heard the mentors or other teachers say, follow the child, follow the child. And in the literal way, you could just follow the child and allow them to do whatever they want to do, but then they are not going to be working at their fullest potential. They're not going to develop their character. They're not going to be able to develop the discipline that's needed for the work that they are meant to do. So what Maria Montessori says about follow the child is that the child is a spiritual being. The child has within itself the qualities that are required to create, to think, to imagine. And for every child to be able to express himself or herself, you have to create an environment that is going to nurture that skill, that quality. She also, through her observations and her scientific discovery of the child, she saw that children love freedom. And so it was not just the child, but humans in general want freedom. And the element of choice and freedom are tied together in a Montessori system. So when she talks about follow the child, she's saying, give a framework, have the limits, and within those limits, give the child freedom to work, because then they are going to be successful. And what Louis Sullivan means by form follows function, again, it's a very simplistic proposition. But, and again, as a young architect, I thought that it meant to have like just very bare bones, basic architecture. But that's not necessarily true. Again, when Louis Sullivan is talking about form follows function, he's talking about looking at the function. What is the function supposed to serve? And then if you go into the details and analyze it, you will come to a form which evolves naturally from the need of the function. So in this case, if we say that to educate the child is the function, then what the education should be should follow the form of the child, the nature of the child, the nature of the human beings. So that's what form follows function and follow the child mean in a nutshell.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes.
Okay. So we have been studying, form follows function quite a bit with this group because we went through the entire kindergarten chats, but we have not spent much time on follow the child. So I want to ask a little bit. So what you seem to be saying is that when Maria Montessori says follow the child, what she's saying is that follow the function in the child, not whatever expressions it currently has, but you look deep into the side and say, what is the function of the child? What is the potential? What is it? What is the direction in which the child needs to grow? And what you're doing is that you're trying to follow the function in the child. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm going to read a little bit of the human potential that Maria Montessori talks about in her book. She says the human personality belongs to all human beings. Europeans, Indians, Chinese, etc. are all men. If therefore certain vital conditions are found to help to the human personality, these concerns and affect the inhabitants of all nations. So, irrespective of where the child is, they all have the seed in them. She goes on to say, what is this human personality? What does it begin with? When does a man become a human being? And she goes further into the explanation of understanding the nature of humans. Does that answer your question, Shrikant?
Yeah. So basically, follow the child means don't follow whatever the surface things are. Don't follow if it's the child is kind of throwing a tantrum. Those are only surface things. Those are just the form. You're trying to kind of look and saying, okay, who is this child and where is it growing? So it's kind of, you're focusing on the function within the child and helping that. So following that, you're trying to create forms and ways of doing things which will enable the child to express its function. Okay.
Yeah. And not just following the whims of the child, because then you're not going to let the child actually get into their best potential or transform to who they can be.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan arrived at the same conclusion that, through their observations independently. Now, they did live around the same time. Louis Sullivan was in the 1870s to, I think, 1856 to 1924. And Maria Montessori lived from 1870 to 1952. So they certainly overlapped. And I also wonder what else was going on in the philosophical realm at that time, because the nature of man, if you read both of their writings, you can see very similar things in them. One of the goals of Maria Montessori's education, she said, education is to help life. And what Louis Sullivan says is that the man's function is to work in harmony with his values, art, and science. So again, knowing their values. Let me read a few excerpts from this, what Louis Sullivan says. Okay, so I mentioned to you earlier that he talked about individualism and democracy. And so individualism is very big for both Montessori and for Louis Sullivan. And here Louis Sullivan says, if we err, let us hope that we may err in the smallest measure. If we prove right, we shall be so abundantly. Thus, democracy will begin to unfold itself to us, the expression of the individual. Democracy is not, as you might inform superficial observation, merely a modern union of a government by and for the people. It is a force, latent and old as earth, a force for whose fulfillment the ages have been preparing the way, dissolving the obstructions one by one and slowly making for its pathway. It is a sense, it is the sense, it is the serene forces of nature that are most powerful, and that force, which we call democracy, lying inexpressibly deep in the spirit of the man, is now ever seeking expression. So he is talking about democracy being more than just a form of the government, and he's talking about the individual. So how do we tap the potential of the individual? He looks at nature, and both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan look at nature. And Louis Sullivan talks about if you look at different plants and flowers, every flower is different, every shape is different, yet they are unique in their own way. They are true to their being, they're true to their whole. So an oak tree, an acorn is true to the oak tree, and so is another plant. Now, one thing that I noticed when my father is into agriculture, and whenever he visits us, we all have plants, but there are many plants. I have a bird of paradise at home, and it never blossoms, never blossoms. But when he comes, he just looks after all the plants, and then every time he comes, our bird of paradise blossoms. And as I was reading Maria Montessori, I realized, if you look at the nature of the plant, and he is giving the plant exactly what it needs to bloom. And he understands it. He's not doing something magical. It's the same thing with children. It's the same thing with humans, that if you understand what each child needs and provide them with just that guidance, they have the potential within them that they can blossom, they can transform, and they can flourish.
I want to follow up on this one with I think the idea of focusing the individuals. Rupali, your book is on your speaker, so it is producing scratching noises.
Sorry.
No problem. So I want to talk about the focus on the individual, because that's one of the things that really struck me when I saw Montessori classrooms for the first time. I was used to classrooms where kids sit on, desks, and whatever is being thrown at them is kind of universal, and it's kind of like catch it if you can kind of teaching. Whereas Montessori, it's like providing all the elements that are needed for growth to all kids at the same time, so that each of the kids can absorb and work on whatever they need to work on. So it's like it's designed so all individuals can flourish. So I think the focus on the individual child is very apparent even in just the structure of the Montessori classroom. What do you think?
So if we look at a Montessori classroom, every individual is taken for who they are. It's not a one size fits all. A true Montessori classroom or a Montessori teacher will spend the time getting to know the child, what makes the child tick, and then create the curriculum to aid the work of the child, not have preconceived notions about where they want the child to go or what they want the child to think. It's actually designed for the individual child. And what happens, something that Maria Montessori discovered was when she was working in India, she found that if a child was interested in learning Sanskrit, which was, it is considered a dead language, much like Greek and Latin, because that's not the common language we use every day. But she found that a child would memorize verses and verses because the child liked the rhythm and was then able to dig deeper into that curriculum. Another child who was interested in mathematics would spend hours on a mathematical problem, and both children were equally thrilled and satisfied. They were not tired of the work that they were doing. So what the Montessori classroom does is, every child can follow their own individual path. And Sherry, if you have something to add, please do. Okay.
Let me go ahead and add one thing, because I want to connect it to the observation that you made, is that when Maria Montessori went to these psychiatric institutions and saw the children there, they had no materials. So I think the middle term there is the materials. So one of her brilliances of Montessori is that she looked at kids that age and figured out what do they need in order to grow. So what faculties need to grow, what abilities need to grow, and converted that into materials and made those materials available to kids at the same time. So they're all there accessible to kid in the classroom. So the child has the flexibility, each individual child has the flexibility of going and picking up that material, which is not the case in a standard classroom where fixed instructions are being fed into these passive children.
I'll share an example. So this year, due to COVID, we could only have a certain number of children in the classroom. And in January, we found that we had new inquiries because children were really not thriving on the online platform in a traditional setting. They were sitting in front of the computer for 6 hours and they had problems with the ears. They were anxious. They some of them couldn't sleep. And so we opened a new classroom. And typically what happens in a Montessori classroom is you have a third of new students and 2/3 of the classroom are returning students. So the 2/3 of the classroom, they are the mentors of the students who enter. But for this particular classroom, because of the pandemic, we had to keep them in a separate room. And it was fascinating to see their reaction to the sensorial and the practical life materials. So these were children kindergarten to grade 3. And they just could not have enough work with the materials. They would pour the water, they would water the plants, they would clean, they would arrange the classroom, dust the classroom. They wanted to make it their own. They would talk to each other about negotiating how they were going to take care of the classroom. And so by just creating an environment that supports their development at their phase of life, for their cognitive, intellectual, moral, social development, you can see the transformation within. We had a boy who could not read at all in 2nd grade. But because of the drive that he wanted to participate in the STEAM fair, he learned to read about elephants and then about robots and made a robotic, I think, lighthouse with elephants and things in his biome, and just started to read in a matter of few weeks. So if you really attend to the child's needs, then they do thrive and they flourish and they want to work. That's the other element that both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan discovered, is that humans like to work, they like to create. They don't like to sit idle. So what do they agree on? We just talked about, the nature of man, and to be able to work with their hands. So both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about the importance of the work of the hand. And I'm going to read Maria Montessori's passage on culture. So she says, if you want a child to grow up in a culture, yes, you can show them films, you can show them activities, you can sing songs to them, you can tell them stories, but none of them take the place of the work of the hand. So she said, the 5-year-old child is cultured not because he possesses the written language, but because he is intelligent and will have learned many things. In fact, our children at 6 years of age already possess much varied knowledge in biology, geography, mathematics, etc., which they gain from direct contact with the visible apparatus that can be manipulated. So those are the materials, Shrikant, that you were talking about. But that is a subject different from what I wish to deal with here. I intended to deal only with the subject of great immediacy, the elimination of illiteracy among masses. Culture can be transmitted by means of spoken word, also by radio and phonographic records. It can be passed on by the help of projections and films. Above all, however, it has to be taken in through activity with the help of the apparatus which permits the child to acquire culture by himself, urged onwards by the nature of his mind, which seeks and is guided by the laws of his development. These laws prove that culture is absorbed by the child through individual experience, by the repetition of interesting exercises, which always require the contribution of the activity of the hand, the organ which cooperates with the development of the intelligence. So the hand-to-brain connection is a huge part of Maria Montessori's work. And let me just read a passage from Louis Sullivan's work. And he says, the man, he infused his bare work with the quality of his emotions and thus found in them the companionship he yearned for because they were of himself. So he's talking about man who has created his own work. His growing intellect might have gone on satisfying his physical needs and amplifying their expressions. Instinct alone in inspiring the work of his hand and his intellect could satisfy the craving of his heart, the hunger of his soul. The man unconsciously began to create in his own image. And so I want to tell a small story about these blocks. They are actually pink in color, and they are one of the basic materials in any Montessori classroom. So this year, our kindergarten and first graders, there were about 3 students working on 2 materials called the pink tower and the brown stairs. So the pink tower goes from a small cube, 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, to the largest cube that you see at the bottom, which is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. And then you have another material which has the same dimensions, but are longer. They're 10 centimeters long. So the children were experimenting, these kindergarten and first graders, and they put the pink tower and the brown stairs together, and they found that they could make it taller because now they had a cube and a rectangular prism, a cube and a rectangular prism. And so they were so excited, and the teacher wasn't even in the classroom. They were building, and you could see their experiment is going on. And by the time the tower reached their height, there was a lot of excitement. Oh my goodness, how are we going to build taller? And so they reached up, and then they couldn't reach anymore. And so they went and got the step stool from the sink area, and they stood, so their problem solved. They stood on it. Now, by this time, there were other students who had gathered around to tell them how to solve the problem. And then they came to a point where they couldn't reach anymore. The tower was quite high. And they said, what do we do? What do we do? And they thought of the 8th grader, who's the tallest person in our school. He is over 6 feet tall. And they said, Mrs. Sharma, can we go and get Noah? Because I said, what do you need him for? He can go and put that on the very top. And so they marched down the hallway to the middle school classroom. And Noah is in the middle of a lesson. And the teacher looks up and they say, we need him. We need him. There's a problem. And so Noah goes with these, children, and he sees the problem and he says, sure. And he goes and puts the last pink cube on the very top. And by this time, the entire lower elementary was there, and they were all clapping and cheering. But you see that they can problem solve, they can build a community, they can collaborate, they can communicate, they can advocate for themselves, all because they have the freedom to do so. They can leave the classroom because the teachers can trust them to leave the classroom. They are respected, so they respect the adults. They know what responsibility is. So eventually, through these day-to-day experiences, they build their character. They become good citizens, moral citizens, and they learn the interdependence. They learn that they're not alone, and that we humans don't function alone. But this is just one small experiment, one small experience from the school, and you see this pretty much all the time.
Wow. Wow. I mean, this is fantastic, fantastic example. I mean, this point about man's powers is huge, because if you look at the traditional classroom, it chops up man's powers, right? You have these kids sitting on their desks, trying to take in conceptual material. Contrast that to the exercise that you are talking about. It is physical. So it's like all their levels, all of their powers are engaged at the same time and are working in concert with each other in an integrated fashion to actually make something. So it's not as if that, okay, I have to now get mathematics, and then I'm going to go and play in the playground, and then I'm going to learn how to deal with my classmates, and then I'm going to learn how to behave. All of it is being done and communicated in an integrated manner throughout the entire time. So it's a great illustration of all of human powers being used in a creative way all the time.
That's very well put, very, very well explained. So how do their methods differ? First, I thought about if Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan were to talk to each other, what would they talk about? I think they would agree about a lot of things, about the nature of man, about education, about individual freedom. But I then thought, would they disagree about anything? And it was very hard for me to find things that they disagreed about. But what I found was their methods were a little bit different. And the way their methods differ. So, Maria Montessori, as we just talked about, she did a lot of research. And through her observations and through her readings, she developed the Montessori materials. Now, they're not all developed by her. She worked in a team of collaborative people to make the musical bells, the music apparatus, the art apparatus. She looked at the works of Newton and Piaget to come up with the materials for reading, writing, math, for geometry, for the sensorial materials. And she developed all of these materials. So there's a structure, there's a very predetermined structure and materials that children go through methodically. Now, as an educator, you can stand back and you can see the big picture. As a child, you just pick what you like, but everything is arranged very thoughtfully in a sequence. So even if a child goes and picks something on the shelf, it's because there was a reason for that thing to exist on the shelf. It just wasn't the whim of the teacher to put something because it looked beautiful or whatever. So her method is very structured for children ages 0 to 9. From 9 years of age, she did lay out a framework about a farm school, children going out in the nature, doing entrepreneurship programs, serving the community. But she doesn't have a very well written plan for that age group. Louis Sullivan takes off where Maria Montessori leaves. So he works with the adolescent and the youth. So he's talking about graduates from college, and he does have a lot to say about education in the formative years, but not as well thought out as Maria Montessori has. And so that's where they differ. One of the things Louis Sullivan in Kindergarten Chats talks a lot about going out in the nature, outdoors and learning from the outdoors. And that's a big part of Maria Montessori's philosophy too in the adolescent age group. But by making observations, by learning from life, Louis Sullivan says you can then prepare yourself to face the hardships or to face the challenges of your life. Now, one of the things that was, very interesting for both their lives was they both had a difficult life. They did not have it easy. And yet with all those challenges, both of them have produced amazing amount of work and amazing quality of work. It just goes to show their human potential in the work that they've done.
Can I comment on the difference in methods?
Sure.
So one difference that I see is difference between curated environment versus non-curated environment. So Maria Montessori has the, she's working with kids, typically like 3 to 6, but that's the core of it. She's designing the entire environment for them. And so she's able to put in only the things that are going to help them to grow. The equivalent environment for a graduate student, for Louis Sullivan, is the world. And the world has a lot of stuff which is actually not very good. So a lot of his emphasis, actually, if you look at the kindergarten chats, a lot of the emphasis is saying no to a lot of things that are there in the environment to refocus the mind on the few things that are living in the environment, in the cultural environment, and then going back to nature as the source of all inspiration. So the way in which they use the environments seems to be different.
Yes, very true. I'll share a little excerpt from Louis Sullivan's part about looking at nature and looking at nature as a whole entity and then accumulating from there. He says, when you accumulate abundantly, absorb totalities, not fragments. So look at the whole picture. Grasp the largeness of things, not the petty isolated aspects. Lay hold upon the warm significance of realities, not the mere cold currency passing from hand to hand. Seize upon the drift, the color, the intensity, the what you may call it, of the moving, teeming life about you, not merely upon its broken facts of definition, and follow every path, every trail that leads towards emotional and spiritual riches, paths hidden alike to the heedless and the oversure. And then when you give with abundance. And that is to live.
Wonderful.
So now, Shrikant, you talked about a traditional classroom and a Montessori classroom. So these are both back in 1800s, and I can say both still exist in 2021. So we have an India pod on our online school. During the pandemic, we were able to serve our students, serve students from India. And we started working with them in December, and now it's July now. So in December, they could barely speak complete sentences in English. And our humanities teachers started working with them. And, initially the children didn't understand what he was saying. He had an American accent, he was loud, he had so many different stories to tell. His whole approach was different because they were used to sitting at their desk and listening to the teacher. Clearly in the picture that says traditional, you know who the teacher is. On the right, where is the teacher? The environment is made for the child. In a Montessori classroom, typically you don't see the teacher. The teacher's usually sitting on the floor with the child, doing their work individually, and the teacher's not commanding any attention. Now, in the traditional method, so what happened was with the India pod, the teacher worked with the students, and within 3 months, they were reading Shakespeare fluently. Within 4 months, they had participated in an international creativity competition and won the competition and moved to the global finals. So that was all about theater, problem solving, building, creativity. Within 6 months, so in June, they participated in a nationwide speech storytelling competition. They had to write their own story and they could use theatrical ways to present. And they presented, and day before yesterday, we got the awards. They came in third place. In, and this is with children who didn't know how to read and speak clearly in English or form. They were not confident at all. So the teacher and our school nurse and I, we met with the students yesterday and we said, okay, so what's your experience? And what this student said is, in India, the child is not expected to know anything. And so they believe that the child cannot think for themselves. So the teacher has to tell everything. And in a Montessori system, the child is empowered to think. That is a huge difference. When a child can think and problem solve, they develop confidence. They develop the love for learning because it's their own. Nobody else is asking them to do. There's no rebellious nature that you see because they have the freedom to be who they are. And I asked the students, so what changed? I mean, how did you become confident? How did you learn to think for yourself? And they said that Mr. Malinsky, who's their humanities teacher, he always listened to them. He always had the curiosity when they talked. And what are the good qualities of a teacher? The good qualities of a teacher are to be able to respect and believe in the individual child. And when you believe that this child can get to the potential that they're meant to be, we don't know what their potential is. We don't know what great things they're going to do. We just know they have this potential. But by giving it the fuel that it needs, you can let them be creative and flourish and thrive. And so they said, we never miss his class. It's not part of school. It's late in the evening for them. And when people ask them, what are you learning? They say, we don't even know what to say to them because we're learning history, we're learning language, we're learning math, we're learning science, we're learning everything. And we're having a lot of fun. So that is the big difference between the traditional and the Montessori.
Wow. Can I say something about this? I mean, firstly, Dave is amazing, to be able to do this, especially on Zoom. But I think the principle is Montessori principle, because if you look at these two, right, there are two points I want to make, two aspects. One is the seat of power, seat of initiative. Where is the seat of initiative in both these pictures? On the picture on the left, there is no initiative in, children are passive. All the initiative is with the teacher, and it is coming at them, that you're just, at best, you're passively expected to absorb. But on the picture on the right, the entire initiative is within each of the child. So one is that. The second, it was very interesting that the children talked about listening. Okay, because like the picture on the left, the motto is that, children should be seen, not heard. And so the idea that the child has something in them worth the curiosity of an adult, of the teacher, that, it's a being worth listening to. That's a profound point. And only if that is the condition, then they will learn how to speak or how to initiate. So both these points are together. Thanks, that was amazing. Thank you.
So what Maria Montessori did was she set up her classrooms. Her very first classroom it's called Casa de Bambini, and she did these experiments. I mean, they were the very first children even experiencing this. So what she found was the three key elements were the prepared environment, the prepared teacher or a guide, and the autonomous learner. So the prepared environment, as Shrikant said, it's very carefully curated. And that environment is meant to foster independence. So everything is made for the child. The adult is secondary in that environment. Everything is made to stimulate the curiosity of the child. And engage the child into building, into solving, into problem solving, into learning at their own pace. What happens because of this is that children, if they are interested in a particular subject matter, they can really spend time and dig deeper till they're really satisfied. And when they're satisfied, they put it away and they move on to the next thing. But to give them that time, the environment provides all the resources that they need. And because of that, the adult carefully makes sure that there are no obstacles in the way of their learning. It's called the uninterrupted work time. It is so sacred. I know yesterday you did a talk on flow and I completely missed it, but it's one of my favorite subjects is the flow that you see in the Montessori classroom. And Maria Montessori graphed it and she saw that it takes a little while for children to set up their activity, to move, and that's where the movement happens. They get up, they go get a tray, they get the materials, they gather all the work, the tools they need, pencils, erasers, paper, paints, whatever they may need for the activity. They set it up on their workspace. So it's a very defined space which belongs to them and no one can interrupt them when they have their work on a rug. Then they start getting into the activity and then they actually get in the flow and they are deep in engagement. They do their work, they finish, and then the peak kind of comes down in a very natural way. And then they get up to roll up their rug, put the work away, get a drink of water, chit chat with somebody, touch base with teachers. I mean, does that sound like a normal workspace, work environment for adults? That's exactly how it is for children. And so not everybody is doing the same math paper at the same time. Children who work at different levels in a traditional classroom often feel the stress and anxiety because they are left behind or they're the last one to do something. In a Montessori classroom, there is nobody you're not doing anything at the last as the last person because your activity is different from somebody else's activity. So that competition isn't there. The competition is with themselves. Can I be better than who I was yesterday, what I did yesterday? Is my learning better than what it was yesterday? And so there is this normal flow during the uninterrupted work time. Children get about 2.5 to 3 hours in the morning when they are at their best learning time. And the classrooms are they're not silent, but they're quiet. You can hear a purposeful hum because children, if they're working together, they're talking softly to each other about the work that they're doing. If a teacher's giving a lesson, the teacher's doing it very softly too. So no one is interrupted by the other person's activity. And because of that, children can take their time to learn. They don't feel pressure. And so things about attention, anxiety, depression that you see in traditional classroom environments as young as children, 6-7 years of age, you don't see those manifest as much in a Montessori classroom. So that's the prepared environment. The second part is the prepared teacher. And Maria Montessori really emphasizes the appearance of the teacher, the physical appearance, that the teacher is clean, well-groomed, well-dressed, has good manners, is a role model, because children are going to emulate this adult in their environment. And I would say it's the prepared adult. At home, it's the prepared parent. And when the parent is not prepared, the language or the actions or the behavior that the parents exhibit, the children emulate those behaviors. Um, the other thing that Maria Montessori does is observations. She makes a lot of observations. The teachers make a lot of observations. And based on the observations, they tweak their lessons for each child. So the observations, it's almost like the OODA loop for the classroom, because there is a system that is going on. And within the system, the teachers tweak and they say, oh, this child is struggling with this material. Let me show the math problem with another set of materials. Maybe I can bring in another child. And so they make these quick adjustments to their lesson plans. And very quickly, the children can then move on to the next level. Now, what happens in a traditional classroom, teachers don't have the freedom to do those finer tweaks in their lesson plans. You have a lesson plan, you have a curriculum, you have to do it just that way. So that's a big difference. The teacher's usually observing and not interrupting. So the teacher doesn't interrupt the child during the process. And the teacher is truly the part of the environment. It's not the dominant piece in the environment. And so the teacher is in the environment, usually moving around very quietly, hands behind their back so they're not hugging and touching. That's part of the respect in the classroom. So those are very fine details in a Montessori classroom and the Montessori prepared teacher. When I was talking to our advisor, Mark Powell, and he was talking about how it takes an adult to transform. It takes 3 years for a Montessori teacher to really understand Montessori, and the adult is transformed, and thus the child is also transformed. So one of the things that Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about is, how we aim for the best. So now here's the autonomous learner, full of potential, can do really high quality work. And so the child, when is in this environment with a teacher who's well prepared, can then lead herself into spontaneous activity. I'm interested in learning maps. I'm interested in learning all the countries and animals of South America. They can spend the whole day with an encyclopedia and make their drawing and draw animals and plants, which children absolutely love to do. And along the way, they learn facts about it. So the activity is very spontaneous. It's not planned by the teacher. Can you imagine a teacher has 24 students, and if they have to plan every single activity for the whole day for each child, it's an enormous task. But believing that a child can plan for themselves, giving the power to the child. Because of that, the learning is exciting. They're not tired. They're not, they're exhausted in a very healthy way, but they don't stop learning. And when a child is motivated at that inner psychic level, they transform. I can't emphasize enough when I say children transform. We've had students who, as a 6th grader, came with many gaps in his learning and left the school as an 8th grade graduate with, being a very kind, moral person. I'll share a quick story of a parent who actually came to our school the other day to share this story with me. Her son came to our school in 6th grade, and we didn't have 7th and 8th grade back then, so he moved to a private school. And as a middle school student, that private school they choose one boy and one girl as the principal for the principal award. And the teachers chose him because he was a problem solver. He was a kind person. He had good moral ethics, and he was academically well-rounded. He was able to reach out and make connections with many people. And his mother came to see me, and she said, I have to tell you that the teachers at your school saw the potential in him. because all of his elementary years, he would just languish. He was in a traditional classroom and he was bored. He would just lie on his desk and he was just allowed, he would finish all his work because he was capable of that. So then after those sheets were done, he would just be in a corner, and as long as he wasn't making mischief, the teachers would leave him alone. And so his grandfather said, when he came to pick up his son at his grandson, he said that was the first time in all the years of this child's childhood that he saw this child walk out of the school, head held high, shoulders back, smile on his face, and just bursting with life. He said, I've picked him up every day from kindergarten to fifth grade, and he's transformed. So those are the stories that Maria Montessori talks about in her book also. So when you follow the child, you really tap into their latent potential. So what does a Montessori classroom look like? I'm going to play this video. It is a little bit long. It's about 4.5 minutes, but it shows how learning happens. How do children learn in a Montessori classroom? Shrikant, this 5 minutes, 4.5 minutes, okay?
That's good.
So what happens in a Montessori classroom? What this little thing showed, it is just a moment in the classroom. A young child, so Montessori classrooms are multi-age classrooms. We live in a multi-age society. We don't live with just, our age group people. Similarly, in a Montessori classroom, you have that. Now, you saw this older child helping a new student learn how to roll a rug. Very simple activity, but although it takes time, the teacher did not interrupt. The teacher did not rush them. The teacher did not say, come on, let's go. We have to get to circle. The teacher allows them the time to really get the activity. You saw how the younger child emulated. He did exactly what the older child was doing. And then later in the day, when another child struggled with it, this younger child was able to teach the student how to do the work without any request from anybody else. It was his own motivation because he knew something that he could then impart to somebody else. That's the gift of giving. That's what Louis Sullivan talks. When you receive abundantly, you can give then in the same manner. So why is this method then not so successful? And both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about prejudices and obstacles in the way of learning. I want to read a particular passage from Kindergarten Chats where he says, if an institution whatsoever were to receive healthy lads, and after 4 years of care, that's 4 years of architecture college, return them mentally and physically crippled, broken-winded, weak-hearted, and infected, there would be a hue and cry. And why? Because we would easily see and understand. It would speak at once to the heart, to the intelligence. It would be everybody's business. It would create popular clamor. But when precisely such men are taken in by an institution, so-called of learning, a so-called school of architecture, and in 4 years are turned out of it mentally dislocated, with vision obscured, hearts atrophied, and perverted sensibilities, who cares? And why? Because it's not easily seen. The social consequences are not obvious. It's nobody's business but ours. And I think, when a building collapses, which we just recently heard in Miami, I mean, that's a disaster. And when you see something like that, you can physically see it. But the damage that we are doing to the brains of young children by not giving them the freedom, that is really inexcusable. It's shocking and should not be allowed. So both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk extensively in both their books about prejudices. Maria Montessori says, she had people who came to see her school, and she saw that the children were actually doing, the people saw they were actually doing their work, but they were so biased by their own opinion that they would not believe what they saw. So let me just read one passage from her book. This prejudice implies the understanding of the fact that child constructs himself, that he is a teacher within himself, and this inner teacher also follows the program and a technique of education, and that we adults, by acknowledging this unknown teacher, may enjoy the privilege and good fortune of becoming its assistants and faithful servants by helping it with cooperation. So all she is asking for adults to do is to believe in the child and to help them along their way. So then I thought, what if Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan worked together? What would actually happen? I had a lot of fun thinking about this. And I also then had a dream about it. I'll talk about my dream later, but one of the things that occurred to me, in his work about how does an architect go about solving a problem. Louis Sullivan talks about a problem, that a problem has its own solution, that if you seek the steps within the problem and see its own evolution, you will come to its own solution. Now, here the problem was creating for Maria Montessori. She was not an architect. And the problem for her was to create an environment that promoted the growth of the individual, that facilitated independence, that allowed freedom of choice, and for children to work in harmony. So when she looked at her first school, and all the materials were kept in glass cabinets and behind closed locked doors, the children could not access anything without the permission of the teacher. And so the doors went off the shelves. The sinks and the tables were too high for the children. And so she had tables made for the sizes of the children's anthropological proportions. But then she found that children couldn't sit at a table for too long. It's unnatural. It's unnatural even for adults to sit for too long at a table and a chair without stretching. And children like to work on the floor. They like to spread things out. And so the work is, there's a large space in a Montessori classroom for children to lay out their work. So you can see that, if you break the components of a design problem, you don't have to be an architect to actually arrive at the solution. And so both, when form follows function, that is, you're creating an environment for the child, you can then look at all the finer details. And if you look at follow the child and go by those two principles, you can actually arrive at a very beautiful environment made for the child. What Louis Sullivan does, he has these, so this is an example of one of his banks, and he built several of these small banks in the Midwest. And they are beautiful. They are lovely spaces to work in and experience. So when you can live in harmony with the environment that you create for yourself, then it's a pleasurable place to work. It's a piece of beauty. It's a piece of immense pleasure. And that's the kind of environment both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan would want for children and adults in our society. So they didn't get to work together. So what can we do about it? How can we continue their work? They left us with their legacy in books and the work that they created. I mean, they both, Maria Montessori traveled around the world and wrote her handbook. She gave lectures, she trained teachers, she built many schools around the world. Louis Sullivan built many buildings. He wrote books, he talked about the human nature. So what can we do about it? And some thoughts, one of the things is plant good ideas of thought in children and look at nature. What is the human potential? So I'm going to read a part from Louis Sullivan's work. And let me just get to it. It's towards the end of his book, but he says, then how are we to receive nature? By opening wide the doors of your imagination, of your mind. You have locked the door in her face. You have thrown away the key. First, take care scrupulously for your individual and collective physical health. So he talks about humans as the worker, physical, mental, moral, ethical, creative person. Thus you will achieve the first vital preliminary, a quiet, strong, resilient nervous system. Then your five senses will become accurate interpreters of the physical surroundings. And thus, quite naturally, Will the brain resume in its normal power to act and to react? Second, begin by the establishment of a truly democratic system of education. The basis of this must be character. So I cannot emphasize enough about how Maria Montessori talked about the moral development in the adolescent child, that it is important for children to know what is right, what is wrong, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. How do you conduct yourself when you're out and about in the world? What are the norms? What are the natural laws? What are the man-made laws? Why do we live by these laws? So it's important to tell them stories about our history. It's important to give them examples of great men and women who have lived these lives so that they can be inspired by them. It's important to show them work of the highest quality, whether you're teaching them art or music, literature. Show them the highest possible potential that has existed in our history so that they can achieve that and go further with that. Such system of education will result in the equilibrium of body, mind, and heart. It will therefore develop real men and women as in nature's desire. So doing, all aspects of your activities will change because your thoughts will have changed. All of your activities will then take an organic and balanced coherence because all of your thoughts will have a common center of gravity and integrity of the individual man. Thus, as your thoughts change, your civilization will change. So you have no need of force, for force is crude and inefficient instrument. Thought is a fine and powerful instrument. Therefore, have thought for the integrity of your own thought. For all social power, for good or for ill, rests upon the thought of the people. This is the single lesson in the history of mankind that is really worth the while. And so to talk about what are the powers of man, and here again, both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about democracy, individuality, and freedom. And when we humans have the choice and freedom, we can then be free. We no longer have to be, bound to somebody else's desires. We can then create on our own will. The idea of will is huge in both Louis Sullivan's work and Maria Montessori's work. Both of them talk about discipline and structure, that you cannot just you cannot train your mind and body to be able to think and work at the level that it is possible for humans to do without having certain form of discipline. And when typically in education we think of discipline, we think of punishments. And that's not what Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan talk about. They talk about inner discipline. How do you become mindful? How do you center yourself? How do you create a rhythm of your own life to be able to think, to be able to create, to be able to be a creative spirit? So that brings to beauty. If you walk into a Montessori classroom, that's the very first thing that people notice. I know a friend who has a preschool in California, and the parents at her school always say that when they enter her classroom, they almost feel like they're entering a temple or some sacred place, because it has that calming, holistic approach, or feel the ambience just makes you feel welcome in that space. So beauty is a big part of both Louis Sullivan's work and Maria Montessori's work. And they, both talk about the value that beauty adds to the human mind, the peacefulness that we feel with it. So both of them also talk about the spiritual being and the potential of imagination and creativity. We didn't even talk about that today, but that's a huge topic for both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan, that once you provide this environment, once you have disciplined your mind, once you know how to work with your hands, then you can create, you can imagine. And then finally, for both of them, how does man fit in this society? After all, our society is made of individuals. What is the social context? And the highest power that Louis Sullivan talks about for man, he says the highest power of man is love. It's compassion. It's to love your values, the work that you do, the people you live with, the environment that you're in, this grand universe that you're in. And Maria Montessori talks about the child's journey in discovering how the child fits in through the child's work. As the child gets into the adolescent age group, it's no longer about the child itself. It's about the peer group, about the family, about the immediate environment, about the community. And so there are projects with entrepreneurship and with community service, so they can think beyond themselves and become a meaningful part of the society. So how can we carry on their legacy? I'm just going to show another excerpt from the school. It's just how school can be, that not all schools are like this, but school can be joyful. So it is possible. It is possible to carry on the work that Maria Montessori envisioned, that Louis Sullivan envisioned. Maria Montessori talked about her dream as an education, a new education from birth onwards must be built up. Education must be reconstructed and based on the laws of nature and not preconceived notions of prejudices of adult men. The basis of the reform of education and society, which is a necessity of our times, must be built upon the scientific study of man, the unknown. And Louis Sullivan talks about dreaming. He says, I would teach the art of dreaming as I would teach the science of thinking, as I would teach the value of action. He who dreams not, creates not. The greatest man of action is he who is the greatest and a lifelong dreamer. For in him, the dreamer is fortified against the destruction by a far-seeing eye, a virile mind, a strong will, a robust courage. And you can see in this picture the beautiful ornamentation on the top of a column that it just, when Louis Sullivan talks about the work representing the man, you can see this picture with this tree bursting with life, with vigor, with vitality, with color, and it's ornamentation and architecture, and it's still form follows function. So it can be a very simple proposition, but it is possible. And then I'm going to end with my dream. I told you I had a dream because when you're reading Louis Sullivan and looking at all this beautiful work and you're engaged in Montessori every single day, you just can't help but dream. So I had a dream about my school, and it was a beautiful building made of ferrocrete, and Sherry can probably understand that. So it's a concrete shell, and typically most ferrocrete shells are just stark and they just have their lip. But the entrance to the school was an arch made of the ferrocrete shell, white in color, and in its concrete were all these forms in nature rising up. So you have the ferns, you have the ocean life, you have butterflies and spiders and beautiful forms of life with the fronds, the fiddleheads, the fronds of fern, mushrooms, and they all start from the base of the building, of the entrance, and just go about to the level of the children's eye level. And children are very curious, and the entrance to the school is full of curious things that they can stop and wonder about and spark their imagination even before they take their step into the classroom. So I will end with that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Rupali, that was fantastic. That was fantastic. Folks, it's time for questions from you. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to ask questions. I have to tell you, my favorite part was the grandfather talking about his grandson. That was very, very touching. Thank you. So next up is going to be Joya, followed by Brian. Joya.
One of Louis Sullivan's core ideas we learned was the idea of the art of expression, that architecture ought to be an art of expression. And I'm curious if you see any connections with that idea in Montessori.
So the children are very expressive in the way they conduct themselves. They are not as, I would say, sophisticated as adults are in the way they display themselves, their work, their emotions. They are in the moment. They say, they do, they act in the moment. And what you see is when they are in a Montessori environment and they've gone through that training, the way they conduct themselves is an art of expression of themselves, of who they are. And as I mentioned, this parent who came and said, our child was transformed is because he now conducts himself. That's his expression. That's who he is. Once the children are anchored morally in who they are, they can then express that in the way they work. You saw Anne Frank's metal inset work at the beginning, very similar to Louis Sullivan's stained glass window. And that's just a child. And you see that on a daily basis in a Montessori classroom where the standards are held high, where excellence is expected of them. So whether they make a map or whether they write in their penmanship, we have students who do calligraphy and they have, the Declaration of Independence handwritten for hours. They will write in beautiful calligraphy. And so, or other, one of our teachers, he has Confucius statements in the classroom laminated, and those are used for penmanship. So when they practice their penmanship, the teacher often talks about what the statement means. And it's a philosophical conversation at that point, but the child doesn't know that, but it becomes a part of who they are. Does that answer you, Joya?
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Brian, Joe, and Jyoti. Brian.
So this has been wonderful for me, a reminder of what Montessori is all about. Thank you very much. Yeah, I really do think it's a great way of approaching education. And thank you for bringing in Louis Sullivan. That was really fascinating. I'm going to take this Zoom video. I hope we can't post it and share it with my children. They now have their own children, and it'll be a chance for them also to rethink and reorient what they're doing with their children. The last question I have, though, what is the name of your school and where is it located?
So the name of our school is the TEC Schools, Think, Explore, Create, and we are located in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Thank you.
We also have an online school.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Rohit, could you go ahead and post the URL in the chat, please? Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Jyoti. Joe.
Hi, Rupali. I mean, it was an amazing presentation. It was absolutely fantastic. I mean, it was a joy to watch, specifically the children interact and teach one another, and how they, you know, the one had taught the other one in the morning, and in the evening or the afternoon later that day, somebody was teaching, you know, and it shows how like a goodness can manifest itself. But we've talked about here, learning by teaching is such an important thing, so that, you know, it was a benefit to both parties involved. You talked a little bit about how character formation is actually really important within schools, within Montessori schools. What are the characteristics that you look for in a teacher when you're hiring into them? And then the other part about it is that how can you get this to the masses? Like I mean, I know that's a bigger, huge kind of question, but how can you expand? That's because I think those two are synonymous with one another. You can identify the teachers that can function in the school, and then how do you then get it to other people, as many people as possible?
Great questions, Joe. Thank you. So to answer your first question, what are the qualities of a good teacher? I would say when I hire, I look for teachers who are passionate about something that, you know, that they care about, whether it's music, language, art, physical exercise, and interests they have. Because when somebody is passionate, they care deeply about the issues that come along with them. The second part is to be innovative and creative. So if they are just teaching in the classroom and not doing anything else, chances are that they're doing the same thing over and over for 20 years, and then they are in a rut. But if they're doing something outside of the school that fuels their inner desire, then they're going to bring that learning or that innovation to their classroom. Another part of our school particularly is that we work across an interdisciplinary program. So the teachers are working intimately with each other on teaching music, art, history, geography, science together. And so the teachers have to communicate and collaborate. So that's another quality I look for is, are they problem solvers? Are they, you know, able to work in a team? And their integrity, basically, are they good human beings? Because that's what the children are going to emulate. Now, the second part about scaling, that I think that does beg for a different conversation, but a few things, you know, the pandemic has shown that you have opportunities, you know, our teachers are now teaching children across continents, geographical areas. It does not take the place of the brain to hand work, the Montessori materials, that is not replaced on the online platform, but you can still do quite a bit. There are many organizations that are actually making Montessori mainstream. There's Jeff Bezos's schools. There are, you know, Higher Ground is another Montessori education system that is building many schools. The main thing is actually with the parents. The more the parents understand the importance of individualized education, what the potential lies within their own child, and they speak up and they say, I want this for my child. I think that's what is really going to change the environment. Because you could have mass produced schools and teachers trained, but the parents at the end of the day have to believe and have to trust that this is a system that's going to work for them. I feel that trying to change large institutions is very, very difficult. And so starting at small private level is nimble, and they can quickly maneuver and make things happen that large organizations cannot do.
Excellent. And I think what you have done with Dave and Shakespeare in India is a very good example, because I think with relatively small resources, relatively small cost, I think you have transformed lives of these kids. Even if it is a very small part, they, I think, are transformed. And that may be kind of like a small thing that you can do that you can use as a lever. Thank you. Next up is Jyoti.
Rupali, I don't even have words to describe how I feel inside after looking at your presentation. As usual, it was amazing, really. And Joe said it all. I like the way in the introduction you said, you receive abundance, you give abundance. And this was a prime example. Children learn more in a free environment where they're receiving, and then they learn how to give back. And that should be the motto of the society, that you have, you receive in abundance, and then when your time comes, you give back. And that's where it comes from, it stems from there. So having said that, as you know, I was also an educator. I don't know what I am anymore, but at one time I was an educator. And when I was looking at your presentation and the classroom environment and what have you, I felt like how many students in the regular private public schools would have been kept from going into special education. Because in regular traditional programs, the child is not supposed to learn at his or her pace. They are supposed to learn according to the standardized curriculum. And when the child is not in the mold of standard curriculum, he or she is diagnosed to be learning disabled, emotional disturbed, and attention deficit disorder. Now we have 14 categories: autism, Asperger's, and what have you. So looking at this environment, I felt that justice was done to these kids, is being done to these kids. And these children who are learning from other students, the little one that I saw, he was just sitting passively, and I didn't even think at that time he was paying attention. But he was paying attention. He needed help from the older child, and he learned, and then he was teaching another child. And I think that is the best way to learn. And nature tells you the same thing. It doesn't tell you anything different. So I think your school and other schools which are based on this concept of teaching the child at his own pace and learning, through doing, is definitely the right way to go. Now, I have one question. The question is, if a child is very passive by nature, now I'm looking at these kids who were eager to learn in some way or the other, not maybe initially, maybe with the help of the others, they were able to learn. What if you have few students who are very shy or passive, and they're afraid to show their immaturity or lack of skills to the other students, because they are very fragile years for the self-esteem, development of the self-esteem. And if they don't want to be compared in their own mind with the other student who has shown them how to do it, and then they are not able to do it, how do you address a child like that then? That's my question.
Excellent question. Excellent question. And Jyoti, you summarized what school should be so well. Thank you for that. We have two teachers in this conversation. Jill and Nancy are attending this conversation, but I don't know if they'd like to add anything. But they have students, precisely like you said, who are very shy, who are very fragile. And you know, we've had a few students who were told by the teachers at 5 years of age. This is a true story. They were told by the teacher that they were unteachable. To me, that is criminal. I mean, those children are now 10, 11 years old, and they still remember that. And the thing is that when you can understand what makes a child tick, what really the child's strengths are. You know, in a traditional system, we are so focused on the negative. Oh, you can't read, you can't do your math, you can't tie your shoes, you're always late, you're not paying attention. Those negatives are, they take a lot of, you know, it's like black and white. The black will suck in all that energy. So those negative words that the child is listening really hampers the child's self-esteem, confidence. They crushes their soul, really. And what we found is by giving them wings, so to say, we have children who may not do really well in reading, but they love poetry and they can memorize poems. We have children who can cook really well. They're very passionate about cooking, and so snack time is a huge part of their life. They can prepare the snack and present it, and then the teacher can talk about, you know, during circle they can say, can you tell us how you prepared the snack? So by giving them opportunities to talk about their strengths, every child has some strengths, every individual has some strengths. It's a matter of just looking at those strengths and identifying them and not paying so much attention to the negative. Because when you ask a child to talk about their strengths, they are motivated because they can speak with confidence. Because like Louis Sullivan said, they've done it with their hands. It's become a part of who they are. They're satisfied. They can talk about it. And then through that backdoor entry, you can teach them the areas that they're challenged in, whether it's reading, writing, math. And what we found is if you do this consistently, that is, you focus on the strengths, you're not praising them, you're not giving them false praise, but you are talking about how they're problem solving in other areas. We find children who struggle with academics often perform really well on stage. So the musical, the music program, the poetry recital, gingerbread castle making, all of those become really areas, places where they can shine. But when a curriculum doesn't have that, when it's not able to nurture those skills, then you really can't help a child. The other thing about labeling, I mean, it's shocking, you know, when a child goes through an IEP system in a traditional environment, that label does not leave them. And it's detrimental. A child can move out of those labels. It's good to kind of identify where the child is struggling so you can support them with alternative methods. But when they reach those methods, typically the system does not drop the label, and that's detrimental. So yeah, I have Jill and Nancy here. Jill and Nancy, would you like to add anything?
Sure, let me turn my video on. Okay. Hello, sorry, I'm not in the best lighting here. But the question as to how do you build a child's confidence so that they do participate in learning in a Montessori classroom. Well, when children start in a Montessori classroom with no prior experience, we always give them a lot of lessons because they have to have lessons so they know how to use the materials. we'll also often pair them up with a more experienced student who can also give them lessons. So by learning the materials, that builds their confidence. The materials are very appealing, and all children want to get their hands on the materials. So I've never seen a child in a Montessori classroom just sit there for a long period of time and not do something. Sometimes they need a little coaching, a little encouragement. Often we'll make suggestions. Would you like to do this? Or would you like to do this? Or would you like me to show you, this, what activity, what work would you like me to show you? And so the purpose of learning the materials isn't just to learn the academic subjects, it's to build the child's confidence, their sense of order, and their sense of independence. So a little 5-year-old can take a tray of, with a pouring activity off the shelf, bring it to their spot, sit down, do the pouring activity, clean up, and return it to the shelf. And that simple activity builds their skills, but more importantly, it builds their confidence and sense of independence. So it really doesn't take long to draw a child into working with the Montessori materials and working with the other students. It just seems to happen naturally.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. I think when compared to the traditional schools, I think the fact that the environment is passive and the child is active and teacher is just supportive makes a very different dynamic. Like if a child is shy, it's because it's kind of put along with these 25 kids in desks and something is coming at them. So either they get it or they don't get it, it's fixed. Whereas environment is like offering this entire buffet of things that the child can do. And all of that is designed to actually stimulate all kinds of faculties. So they have so many things to choose from and nobody is actually pushing them to do anything. So I think it's a very different, and as Jill was saying, as they engage that, they build their skills, they build their confidence and grow from there. So that's wonderful. Next up is going to be Sherry. Sherry, what are your observations about Montessori and Sullivan?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Rupali. This is really fantastic. I totally enjoyed this. I've been looking forward to this as soon as I found out you were going to do this. And I have a question about parents. In my experience, I see at the earlier levels, the earlier children's house levels, toddler levels, things like that, the parents really get what's happening in that Montessori environment, but there starts to be issues where the parents' mindset is stuck in that traditional past that certain age. Do you see that same thing happen? And if so, what do you see as a good way to get the parents more into the Montessori mindset?
Yeah, excellent question, Sherry. So I struggled with that as a parent, and I learned how to appreciate the benefits of Montessori because I saw them manifest, in my child's development. But I think the thing to think about is Jacob Bronowski's talk on the long childhood. And I think that's often a missed point by educators and parents. The human child takes a long time to develop. And Maria Montessori broke it down in 4 phases: the 0 to 6 age, the 6 to 9, the 6 to 12, the 12 to 15, and 15 to 18 years of age. And that entire time, the human child is still developing. By the age of 10, we feel they're all grown up. And they're not. They're not able to make judgments. They're not able to make decisions. They are certainly more and more and more capable at every stage of their development, but they are still learning to function in a society. And they're still developing their individual moral being, their who they are. And what happens is when children are really young, they're very dependent on the adult. And so the adults are a huge part of whatever they're doing. So from birth to 6 years of age, you see the adults are extremely engaged. And then at 7 years, you actually can, as a parent, you will notice a difference in your child and the need for independence. And they're no longer clinging to the parent as they did just a year ago. But what happens is, and I hear this often with especially our middle school families, that the child is old enough to take responsibility and make decisions, and they will decide what they want to do. And no, they're not capable yet. And so parent education is important at that point. I think the more we engage parents in conversations, we at our school, we read a book every summer. And this year we are reading The Formation of Man. 2 years ago, we read The Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck. And that book was really profound because across the curriculum, across the classrooms, teachers, parents, and students have formed that common vocabulary to use in the classroom and at home and in our conversations. So now it becomes more complementary than divergent.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Patricia, followed by Joe. Patricia is also an educator. So Patricia, I'm really curious about your comments and questions. Go ahead.
Rupali, thank you very much. This is wonderful. I love Montessori. I'm an occupational therapist, so I'm fortunate that I'm able to kind of control my environment, and I have a lot of the same materials. They're not as fancy. You know, my budget, as my background, I work for the New York City Department of Education. So we are the largest school system in the country. So change happens very slowly there. I'm just curious because a lot of people, you know, naturally complain about education. But one of the things that we have to focus on is accountability and testing and what a child is expected to learn at each stage. And I'm just curious how you in Montessori do kind of assessments and make sure that children are progressing at an appropriate level.
Yeah, very, very good question. So accountability is a very huge part of the program, right? And yet most Montessori teachers shy away from that because then they fall back on follow the child. Oh, I'm just following the child. They're not ready for multiplication or they're not ready for cursive writing. Well, that's not what follow the child means. There are benchmarks. And Maria Montessori herself, when she worked with children, she administered them tests to see were they meeting those benchmarks. And she found that they not only met the benchmarks, but went above and beyond those. They did really well because they were not taught to the test. They were taught to the individual. And because the individual was learning, they were engaged in learning, reading, writing, math, everything that interested them. If they were interested in geography, they had to learn how to read or how to draw and how to calculate distances and things like that. So what happens in a typical Montessori school? Montessori schools are very different from each other. So there's no one standard. The accreditation system does require Montessori schools to be accountable and to have benchmarks. But again, as I said, they're very varied. There's no one set standard. I can tell you what we do at our school. We test our students 3 times a year. In the fall, we do diagnostic tests. We use dibbles to see where they are in their reading fluency. And for older children, 3rd grade and up, we give them a nationwide comprehensive test, again, to see their benchmarks, where their benchmarks are. The teachers meet with the parents in October. That gives them a month to observe each individual child and create a plan for each individual child in their care. And together, the parents and the teachers in October come up with goals for the rest of the year. we work with those goals and a plan. And then in January, we administer the mid-year tests. They're again just milestone tests to kind of see, are they meeting the milestones we set for them? And if they're not meeting the milestones, then what support do we need to put in place? And we have specialized teachers who can provide that support either after school or outside of our school. And then at the end of the year, in May or June, we administer a full comprehensive nationwide test that compares our children to the regional standards to the nationwide standards. And so we do administer. I do believe that it's important to be accountable. We, the principal that I worked for before, Margie Smetana, would say, a child has only one chance and they are under your care. So you better not mess that up. So holding teachers accountable is a very good idea.
Wonderful. Next up is Rob. Rob, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to share something on this topic of testing, because I'm not an expert on it, but we're the engaged Montessori parents who actually show up to all the parent education things at school. So I absorbed some of this stuff. And there was something very interesting, I thought, that one of the teachers at our school, at our kids' school, said about the nature of testing and how traditional testing kind of gets it backwards. So the purpose of testing is to determine whether the child's learning, so that you can then adjust the education and make adjustments to make sure that he does learn the material. He says, if that's the case, then when you want testing to be frequent and low stakes. So you want to be something sort of that you are doing some small quiz or something where it's not a big deal for the kid, where you're really just making an assessment to see where he is so you can adjust what you're doing. As opposed to the way testing generally tends to work in traditional education, whereas it's infrequent, it comes at the very end, and it's really high stakes, right? So you have your finals, and you're going to pass or you're going to fail, and it's one thing at the very end, and it's at the very end when there's no point to it, because you can't, the class, the semester is over, the class is over, you can't do anything more about it. I thought that was interesting, that sort of the inverted approach that a traditional education tends to have, whereas the point of testing is not, I don't think the point of testing really, accountability is an issue. To say, yes, you want to make sure that the kids in this school are doing well, but ultimately the point of the real point of testing and of doing the evaluations of the child is so that you can change something and you can react and you can adjust how you're teaching the child in order by assessing how he's doing so far. So it's really, if it's a totally child-centered thing. Now, I know in the public schools, the problem is, especially in the last 20 years, we've gotten, they had this problem of, well, we have a lot of public schools that aren't doing a good job teaching. So the way to solve that is, let's force everybody to test everything all the time, and let's make everything, for the school and for the teachers, make everything dependent on how their kids do on these tests. And the tests become, the standardized tests become all absorbing, but it's so much oriented around the needs of the adults and the bureaucrats and the federal government, rather than around the needs of the child.
Oh, that's excellent point. Thank you, Rob. Next question is from Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Actually, Laura just sent me a exclamation point by mistake.
Laura, your question. Go ahead. Laura,
in New York, from what I know, is the test result is more about, will the teacher have her job next year, than whether the kids really learn. And that's bad, real bad. And that continues. So the tests are even higher stakes for the kids, and it's not right. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Laura. Great comment.
That is a good point, Shrikant. I just want to share with you. See, Maria Montessori was a doctor. She was a physician, right? So what do we do when we take our child to the physician? We chart their height, weight. Are they meeting the benchmarks that they need to physically, right? The physical attributes. So what about the mental attributes? Things that you can't see. And so there is a way to chart that. Are they engaged in activity? I mean, she actually would graph their activity levels. It's the flow that we talked about. in the meetup yesterday. And so the thing is that when you're teaching to the child and not to the test, then the testing makes sense. Then the teachers actually can modify the curriculum. We do the testing to kind of see, okay, we have a curriculum, we're teaching all these things, but it's a very, very vast curriculum. Sometimes you get to everything and sometimes you don't. So where are the gaps and where are you dropping the ball? And what can we learn about what we are doing about ourselves and how can we tweak it? So in some cases, whereas Laura said, the teacher will lose their job, that doesn't work really for the child or the teacher. Thank you.
I just want to make one comment because it kind of it's a theme that runs through. It's kind of child-centric versus kind of education-centric. So the child-centric, because you talked about several examples of this bright kid who was basically completely broken as a result of school from kindergarten to 5th grade. And I feel really terrible about it because that's such a waste. That's really horrible to do to a kid. At the same time, and that was happening because he was bright. Okay. Somebody talked about, what about, Jyoti talked about shy kids, right? What about shy kids? Again, the system that is there doesn't really account for shy kids. Other people talked about learning disability. Again, this traditional system fails them. So basically, any variation of any kind, it's bad. So I think of it in terms of kind of child-centric versus not. This is profoundly child-centric method of education because Maria Montessori did such a spectacular job of identifying what the child needs in terms of development of faculties in a comprehensive way, converted it into material which is passive, which is sitting there, always accessible. So it doesn't matter how far the child wants to go on any particular thing. It's all there. So there is a full runway to go in any direction. At the same time, all the possibilities are open. So the whole focus is to say, this is the child, this is where they can go. All of it is available. The education of the teacher, you're talking about that the prepared teacher, the teacher changes because the teacher's mindset changes to saying, I'm going to impart education to these passive kids, to saying, I'm going to be there to help these kids grow out into this entire space that is their life. So I think the child-centric concept captures everything. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea is, again, follow the child. And if the and form follows function, as you were talking, I was just thinking, if the form is the exam or the test material, what is the function of that test? The function is to know what the child knows, what the child doesn't know, and how you can aid the child in getting to where they need to be. So,
right. And actually, a good Montessori teacher is actually observing the child. So he's not actually waiting for even the test. As
Shrikant, we can't quite hear you.
Oh, you can't?
Now I can.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the things the teacher is doing is that, see, a traditional teacher actually has no idea what is going on inside a child. It's 25 kids on this desk. They have no clue what is going on. Whereas Montessori teacher, because the primary action is from the child, the teacher is left free to observe what is going on. So they have a good idea of, okay, this child is having trouble with this, and they're able to step up, to notice problems and step up actually in real time, not even waiting for the test. So there is this feedback mechanism, which is real. And that's very, very powerful. Joe, thank you for your patience.
No, I think that you're capturing so many important things, and that this really is a comprehensive approach to education. And I look at this as almost like a human rights issue to a certain degree. I mean, it really is when you're talking about what children experience. They their lives fall apart, and it doesn't have anything to do with them. It has to do with the system that they're in. Are you as a teacher are able to modify their curriculum and adjust, or do you produce your own materials in order to adjust to the child? That was
Yeah, absolutely.
okay.
So the Montessori curriculum, it follows the same idea of freedom within limits. The teacher is also considered as an individual who can think, who can create, who can, is independent. It's, the whole idea of Montessori is not just the child who is an individual, but the teacher is also an autonomous teacher within the classroom. So there's a framework of the curriculum, but within the framework, the materials aid the teacher. Now there are multiple materials. So if one material doesn't work, you can use another. The teachers will create their own materials to help children learn. I mean, Maria Montessori made materials for the ages of 3 to 6, but then for technology curriculum or some of the science materials, music curriculum, our teachers have developed some of those activities, those materials themselves. There is a lot of freedom for the teacher also within the Montessori classroom, so that they can make the decisions. They don't have to get permissions. I know that in a traditional classroom, you have the bureaucracy and you have to kind of get permissions to make small changes. Even to, when you have a special needs child, you have to constantly make those changes. So in the Montessori classroom, there's a lot of freedom to the teacher to do that.
Thank you. Next up is Sherry, followed by Joe. You had a follow-up. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a tremendous feedback loop, because the teacher is actually continually learning as well, in addition to the student, and then that makes them a better teacher. I mean, that feedback loop is actually critical, and as opposed to only teaching one way, where it only goes one way. That goes back to the active and passive that we were talking about.
Yeah, very true.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Sherry, followed by Laura. Sherry.
Yeah, my comment actually here was an add-on to both what Rupali and Joe were talking about. The Montessori materials are worth looking into if you're not familiar with them, because they are brilliantly designed. They have this, most of them have this absolutely wonderful autocorrect, I'll call it, and maybe Rupali can explain the technical terms of it. So that as a child, say they're working on the pink tower, and each square is 1 centimeter smaller in each direction than the next. When the child's working with it and gets partway up, 1 centimeter is not that much of a distance. But if you get them in the wrong order, the materials themselves alert the child to an error in what's happening, what they're working on. And there's within the child and their own work with the materials, there's always this autocorrect that happens, that the kid notices it. It's not that the error is pointed out to the child by an adult or even by another child. It's because the child is able to notice it with his own work that he can make that correction. And that's a really powerfully brilliant part of the whole system.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic point you make, Sherry, because the teacher is not telling that you made a mistake. You know, how detrimental is that when you keep hearing that this is not correct, this is not correct, here's a red circle on your paper. But the child can say, oh, this is not correct, I can fix it. And that I can fix it leads to confidence, it leads to problem solving, everything. Those materials, as Sherry said, are brilliantly designed.
Yeah, so I want to bring in Louise Sullivan here. I mean, that's the Montessori materials are a superb example of form follows function, because you're saying, I want this material to teach this child this, to develop this child, this faculty. How should this material be? And you're trying to capture everything about development of that in passive material, capturing that in passive material. I mean, that's actually, like a genius level achievement. And these are very simple things, but they are kind of, as Sherry was pointing, autocorrective things.
Yeah.
And they engage, you're like, I particularly love the math material. I mean, those are so spectacular because math concepts are very abstract. And the question is, how do you try the percepts to abstraction so you can derive the abstractions for percepts? And all those materials are designed for that. I remember Sherry telling me the story of, was it Walter who wanted to count till?
Yes, and I agree with Shrikant. One of my favorite materials is the math materials, and specifically, they're called the golden beads, and they start with a little loop on either end in a single golden, usually glass bead, which you think, okay, you've got 3-year-old kids and a bunch of glass beads. This sounds like a disaster. But there's so many things that happen. Those little tiny beads, it's not just math. Those little tiny beads are tiny, and they have to hold them in this pincher grasp, which is developing these muscles, which is necessary for them to be able to write. So writing is happening. But the other thing that happens is they have to learn to count. And so there's bead chains with 1s, there's bead chains with 2s, all the way up to 10s. And what generally happens, not all the kids will do this, but there gets to be a point when some kid in the class gets excited about counting and how high can they count. And they'll start with once you get a 10 rod, I wish I had pictures, a little 10 rod, then you've got 10 10s, and that makes a little plate of little golden beads. And then you need 1,000. Well, that's a cube. So then all of a sudden they're getting 3-dimensional, all of these little stacks of cubes of beads. But the thing is, one of the things that happens when the kids have to be counting is they have to go back to the material shelf and carry the materials back. Sometimes they have to go to the next classroom if they need to borrow more. But the weight of those, because they're glass, they're not plastic. They're glass, so they've got weight. So when you get from 1 bead to 10 beads, it's noticeable. When you go to 1,000, it's noticeable. When you get to 100,000, then you've gathered all the beads from the whole campus's classrooms, and it takes most of the classroom rug to count them, and the whole class is involved, and it stacks up as tall as the kid himself. And then they have to physically move all of that weight back. There is such knowledge that is being imprinted in that little head and those little fingers in that process of counting to how high can I count. It's impressive.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Sherry. Next up is going to be Laura, followed by Jyoti. Laura, what's your question?
Oh, I think I was going to respond to assessment. I think they really need to do portfolio assessments for these kinds of classrooms and get away from that, grading a midterm and a final and that. It's the only way I can see them really truly evaluating the students' work over time. I would say an assessment year after year after year, all the way to the end of elementary school and going into middle school. That would be the assessment I would take of that student over time. And then I'd get a true sense of what their strengths and weaknesses were and how perhaps they overcame them over time. So that's my bit on assessments.
Thank you.
And I have one bit on teachers. The teachers that sometimes we get for elementary school still remain not to be the strongest candidates in the world. And that's a big problem that has to be changed in terms of getting best quality potential teachers.
Mhm.
That's a whole other issue, which should
Thank
be
you.
addressed in another manner. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Go ahead,
you.
Rupali.
Laura, I think that assessment, I mean, you have to look at the whole child, and the standardized tests are just one part of the assessment. So in a typical Montessori classroom, assessment happens on a daily basis that the teacher observes. And when the child teaches to another child, you know that the child has understood that concept, because when they teach a concept to somebody else, their learning is just equally solidified. So the teachers are always observing, and they keep records of that. The second part is that every few months they make a portfolio of things that they're proud of, because they do a lot of art, building, constructing, different projects that you cannot test on a standardized test. And so they write a paragraph about why this piece of work should go in their portfolio, what's so special about it. And in that process, they can reflect. So assessment is also a time for reflection to say, and then when they look at their portfolio, we keep their portfolios for 3 years. So they can see when they started, what their level was and how far they've come. So it's a visual representation of their skills. And every 3 years, they build their portfolios. So portfolio is a huge part of assessment. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Next up is Jyoti.
Yeah, it's a quick question. In the state where, in the city where I live, I don't think I heard of that many Montessori schools. We do have preschools. We have up till 3rd grade, but I haven't heard that many to 8th grade and onwards. My quick question to you is, the private schools over here are very expensive. Public schools are okay, Are your schools affordable by parents, for parents? Like the tuition is it affordable?
For most Montessori schools, they're not as elite as the private schools are. Again, Montessori schools come in a different, you can have a very large, wide range of Montessori schools. There are private Montessori schools, there are public Montessori schools, there are Montessori schools affiliated with religious groups which subsidize the tuition for the families. For our particular school, we've thought about this extensively about, not to make it inaccessible because of finances. That we need to pay our teachers, because the Montessori schools are typically not supported by any other funds than the revenue that they generate. So what is the minimum that you need to charge the students or the parents to make sure that you can continue building the program and be able to sustain the ups and downs of a business? The cycles, they're not always the same. So our school is in the mid-range. It's not a free school like the public schools. It's not as elite as some of the schools where you're almost paying college tuition in a private school. So we are in the mid-range, and we also, during the pandemic, started a variable tuition program for our families that, parents who had lost their jobs or were furloughed, we were able to continue supporting their children's education without having to lose them because of financial barriers. And so that has helped, make education accessible. But you're right. If it's a private school, so it's like a business where you have to get in some revenue to be able to offer the education.
Wonderful. Rupali, this was fantastic. I want to go at it maybe another ways in the future. We are going to be reading Autobiography of an Idea. And especially that earlier part is going to be how Louis Sullivan taught himself, how he learned. And maybe we can do something after that. Other idea I had is that Rob is actually very good at doing voices. So this, when Louis Sullivan met Maria, could be presented in another way, perhaps.
I have no idea what Louis Sullivan sounded like.
Okay.
You've read his poetry.
I think he sounded like Rob.
I try to keep you a little gruffer and grumpier than me.
So we'll have to do some artistic research on how Louis Sullivan might have sounded like. I'm sure we would have records of that. So we'll figure it out. But anyway, so Rupali, this was just amazing presentation, because I think you hit so many things, and it is very fundamental. Both these people, and more than anything else, it's all about human potential. It's the reality of human potential and the seriousness with which both Maria Montessori and Louis Sullivan approach it. And in many ways, that is being ignored. And it is, especially that I still, can't believe the kid and the grandfather story. But that's what is going on. That's what is going on. And people recover to some extent, but that damage at that age is catastrophic. So firstly, thank you for what you're doing. Okay, because I think that's a real value that you're offering to everybody, not just these kids or parents, but to people in general. And to, so it is amazing. So thank you very much, Rupali. Really appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
I enjoy 52 Living Ideas. I think I would not have done this talk without 52 Living Ideas, without this platform, because I had read Louis Sullivan, I'd read Maria Montessori, never put them together in the way that I did now. And it came from another book, How to Read a Book, which Shrikant has done a meetup on that. And, thank you, Shrikant, for giving us this platform.
You're welcome. And thank you everybody for coming and all the great questions. See you soon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.